Hello everyone, I'm Becky Goldsmith from Piece of Cake. This is the last Searching for Beauty video. In it, you'll learn how to add some text or numbers to your quilt. In my case, I definitely wanted to put the year 2020, a year we will not soon forget, and my initials. Part of doing that entails taking your own handwriting, transforming it into something big enough that you can hand applique. I'll cover cutaway applique in case your numbers are very small, numbers or letters, and I'll also cover reverse applique and inner curves, because if you want to take the center out of your 0 on 2020, you'll need to know how to do reverse applique. So, meet me in the studio in just a minute. When I add numbers or letters to my quilt, I like to do it in my own handwriting. You may be more comfortable writing whatever it is you want to write small and then enlarging it. You can do that. You may decide you want to do this with embroidery. You may want to do it with hand quilting or machine quilting. I want to applique 2020 and my initials. The initials I typically go by when I'm initialing anything, so it's Rebecca Marie Goldsmith. So I played around with different kinds of 2s and 0s and decided that I wanted on my quilt, I wanted the text or the date to be 2 inches tall. So I started sketching out the shapes and then I widened them a little at a time. And you can see, let me bring this in a little bit, you can see that it's not exactly pristine. So the more of these lines I made, I eventually found the lines I liked the best and I darkened them. Then I took a second sheet of paper and traced, I didn't have to trace 2 2s and 2 0s because they repeat. So I traced a 2 and a 0 to make templates, because I'm going to want to make templates of this. I did the same thing with my initials, thinking through, do I want to applique a reverse applique, a space inside the R, or do I want to leave it solid? That's small enough, I left it solid, but I did want to reverse applique this space here inside the G, and I definitely wanted to reverse applique this. Could you do that another way? Yes, you could applique down a big 0 and then take a piece of the background and applique a smaller space on top of it. But then that adds dimension, it adds height to the applique. So I reverse applique. What that means is I cut out the fabric from the center of this O and turned under and appliqued this edge. What makes it reverse is that you are cutting through a shape to reveal what's below. Beyond that, it's just like applique. Once you get that trimmed out a little bit, it's just sewing an inner curve. It's actually pretty easy sewing. All right, so I wrote out what I wanted to do, and you can do the same. Just sketch it out until you get whatever it is, whatever your letters are, whatever your numbers are, to the size you want, and transfer those lines to a sheet of paper. I had a sheet of paper, but it's gone. But you get, oh, here, I've got one, like this. So you would just trace onto paper, and I'm not doing a good job of that, but you get the idea. Trace onto this, make your template from this sheet of paper. I also, on another sheet of paper, actually, I don't even think I went so far as to do it on another sheet of paper. I got my piece of vinyl and made a very rough overlay for this. So what I did was draw a baseline where I wanted my letters and numbers to rest. and then I placed it over these drawings, and I worked with the spacing, because you can see here that these are too far apart. I wouldn't want to applique them that far apart, so I played with the spacing on the overlay and got the spacing correct here, and I did the same thing with my initials where I wanted them to be. And I'm going to eyeball the placement on the quilt. This baseline will help me keep things level, but that's how I got this part done. That's how I did the spacing. Okay, I'm going to set this aside and show you how to do the reverse applique. Because you may have you may want to reverse applique your zero as well. So here's my template. I've traced around it on the fabric, both on the inside and the outside. I'm going to take my scissors and cut this out with a 3/16 inch seam allowance. Now, if I had made these shapes smaller, I would want to use a technique called cutaway applique. Because if I had made these, say, 1 inch tall and I cut it out with a little tiny seam allowance, it would be very hard to handle. If I had done that, so for instance, I'll just fake one, if this was my 0 right there, I would cut this out a little bit bigger. I'm adding 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch seam allowance around this one. And I would finger press this. Even with the seam allowance being big, I can do that. Now, why am I using a great big seam allowance here? It's because in some cases, if your shape gets too small, it is too hard to handle. It's too hard to pin. There's just not enough there on your applique block to handle well. If you leave extra fabric around it, see, I'm finger pressing the inside of that hole as well. If I was going to position this, there'd be plenty of room for my pins. I would pin this down. I would do the reverse applique in the center. And once that's done, then I would trim away the excess seam allowance here and applique the outer edges of this. Cutaway applique makes small shapes easier to handle. But this is a 2 inch tall 0. It's just not going to be that hard to pin. So I'm going to cut this out with a 3/16 inch seam allowance. Remember, that is smaller than 1/8. I'm sorry, bigger than 1/8 and smaller than 1/4 inch. It's between 1/8 and 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm moving a little bit fast here. You want to keep your seam allowance uniform. I am not going to cut out that center yet. I am going to give it a little bit of a snip so that it will be easier to get my scissors in there to trim. Now, I'm going to also finger press this seam allowance. Remember that the template is inside that chalk line. So I'm turning the chalk toward the center of the 0 because the chalk is part of that seam allowance. It's not part of the top of the 0. So I'm finger pressing. This is a small curve, so I'm only able to use the fingers on one hand. Then I have a pretend background. On my quilt, I let the numbers straddle the seam at the join of the block and the border. But here, I'm just putting it here. If I were doing this for real, I would position my overlay where I want this to go, and I would have started with the first 2 in 2020. But I would position this, and you know how to do it, so I don't have to belabor that point, pretend like I got that exactly where I want it. I'm going to pat that together to hold it in place. I am going to pin this about 1/4 of an inch away from the inside of the hole, from this line. And the reason I want to pin there first, pin for the interior first, is because the shape is going to lay better if you applique from the inside out. I don't know why that's true. Let's think about why that's true. Probably because as you applique the outside, you might have a tendency to pull it in a little bit as you turn the seam allowance under, and it makes the inside puffy. Where when you are appliquing in reverse and you're turning that seam allowance out, it's encouraging it to lay flatter. That is the way it usually feels to me. All right, so I've got my pins. The other reason why you don't want to trim this out too much in the center is because as you're pinning and manipulating this, if you've cut that out, it's easy to spread it apart and slightly pull your shape out of position. I have already, remember, put a little bit of a trim there. When you do reverse applique, be really careful that you do not cut the background fabric behind here. You are carefully trimming only the applique fabric. Use good, small scissors. Take your time. All right. And I have a needle loaded. Now remember, you're going to sew the way you normally do. So I'm going to bring my needle up inside the drawn line right here, and I will be sewing from right to left, turning that seam allowance under in this direction. Because there is this curve here, I can't turn that under without clipping. When you clip an inner curve, you need a minimum of 3 clips and probably more in this case. So make sure you move the thread out of the way. I'm going to place my first clip perpendicular to the line right there. Almost, well, pretty much close to the chalk. I don't want to cut through the chalk, but I know this fabric well enough to know that it doesn't fray much. And so if I clip too far away from the chalk, it's not going to give enough. I am changing the angle of my scissors with every clip. Your clip should always be perpendicular. Think the way T's cross. Your clip should always be perpendicular to the edge. Now, the thing most people do on an inner curve that is incorrect is that they turn it under one segment at a time. And that gives you a less smooth curve. The best way to do this, dampen your toothpick. So I've got a damp toothpick. I'm holding my fabric kind of like this. So my fingers are supporting the fabric on the underside. I'm going to reach in, and with the shaft of the toothpick, I'm just going to roll that whole thing under. And you can roll it that way. With each pass of the toothpick, I am stretching open the end of the clip. And if you can't, each one of those clips, if you can't get the curve to conform to the drawing you've made, you know, to the line, then chances are you didn't clip it deep enough. I would not open this back up and clip more. I would live with whatever the curve has given me. opening it up to do it again. I've got a little knot in my thread. Opening it up, clipping more, rolling it back under, that just leads to fraying. And I wouldn't do that. So you can do, you can smooth that out with your needle. Sometimes that works. Or if you need to, you go back to using the toothpick. And then this is just an applique stitch. Same. The only difference here is that what you will want to do is make your stitches a little closer together than normal, because all those clips have weakened that fabric underneath there. It's made it more prone to fraying. The other thing you'll want to do is catch a little bit more of the applique fabric on your upward stitch. The reason you do that is because if you were to accidentally come up at the base of a clip and your fabric was prone to fraying and it would spray open, that's bad. It's better if you have a slightly more visible stitch and the fabric stays turned under and smooth than it is to try and make a totally invisible stitch and have little frayed bumplets all the way through, just like that. That's how you do it. So the letters might look a little bit hard when you first look at them, but you've done all of this. You've done a straight up applique, straight lines, you've done outer points, now you've done inner curves, you've done outer curves, you've done inner points. That's all these are. Let me think, is there anything else? I don't think so. You would have the option of doing pieced numbers and letters and putting that into your border, but this is an applique quilt, so personally I wanted to stick with applique and do it this way. And besides, it gives you an opportunity to place your stamp with your writing on your quilt. So here's my finished quilt top. The border fabric, I love it on there, but it is pretty busy. I had initially cut the strips and sewn them on with a finished size of 4 inches, and that was really too big. So I've cut it down. The borders are now going to finish 2 inches wide. I moved my date and initials to straddle the join between the block and the border. Mostly I did that because I wanted them that size, and with the border smaller, they weren't going to fit. So they had to move up, no problem. I chose a fabric that was patterned so that it wasn't so bold. If I had put something in that was more of a solid red, and that was my first inclination, I tried it, it was just too there. I wanted the date and my initials to recede just a little bit, and I did that with the orange and white print. I added one extra little thing, and that is at the center of the quilt, just a little bit off center. See that tag? That is a tag from a t-shirt. 2 friends and I made almost 500 masks, and we ended up finally cutting t-shirts up into strips and using those for the ties instead of elastic, which is a really good trick, by the way. And this tag was on one of the t-shirts, and it says, "Do what you like what you do." Is that not perfect? And it was like a message. It was on the t-shirt that went into the masks that were part of this whole coronavirus year and event. So I put it on. If you have something like that, whatever you want to do to make this quilt your own, don't be afraid to add it. Embrace it. I hope you've enjoyed the whole searching for beauty adventure. I hope you like the quilt that you've made that marks this time in our lives. Enjoy your applique. Please do come back and watch more of my videos and join me for other patterns and other sewing adventures. I appreciate the time you spend with me. May you have many happy stitches.